Each of us came here to this place in our individual spiritual journeys, to the faith of Unitarian Universalism, and to this specific congregation following a unique path that is ours alone. Each of those paths are equally valid. All of them probably had struggles and obstacles and challenges, and all of them asked us to make choices along the way. This is equally true for ministers. This morning, you will hear parts of the journeys that led me and Shay to Unitarian Universalism and to ministry in this faith. Even in one clergy couple, our stories are very different. As you listen to your stories, we invite you to keep your own story in mind. Where did your path begin? Where has it taken you on your journey here? What choices did you have to make? What have you had to leave behind, and what have you kept with you all along the way? If exploring your own story does not feel possible or safe right now, we invite you to just enjoy hearing these pieces of ours, and perhaps you will find some resonance within them.
So I was raised very Catholic in the middle of North Dakota. Church was everything to my family.
And I was raised unchurched until about age 8 or 10, and then my family church shopped for a while before discovering Unitarian Universalism at the Second Unitarian Church of Omaha, Nebraska, which was at the time, this was in the 70s or early 80s, a fairly secular humanist congregation.
So while I was growing up, my family lived literally a block and a half from the Catholic Church. This was the church where my parents got married, where my mom had been baptized, where my grandparents got married, where my grandma had been baptized. And everything and everyone I knew was Catholic. There was no choice to be made in life. Not only did we attend church every single Sunday, but my sister and I and my cousins all attended the elementary school attached to that church, and that school where my dad was the principal, my mom was a third grade teacher, and my aunt was a librarian.
Meanwhile, I went to public school with friends of many faiths. One of the things that led my family to search for a church, actually, was that I began coming home and asking, how come my friends got to go to church and Sunday school and I didn't? After trying a few churches where I mostly remember memorizing scripture to earn little stick-on gold stars, it felt good to find one where I was not only allowed, but actively encouraged to ask questions and to find my own answers.
Questions weren't really encouraged in my Catholic school and church. I didn't really have an idea of what kind of questions I would want to ask anyway, other than I wanted to be involved in church. I wanted to figure out how to get more involved so that I could find some meaning in what was happening. And I was allowed to get involved. I played piano for services from the time that I was 9 until I left for college. I served as an altar girl for a few years, and I was a reader and an usher and youth group and confirmation and all of that, and it was good and well and everything was fine. But what I really wanted and longed for was to feel something in church.
I was looking for meaning and depth too, and deep feeling, and finding it intellectually but not spiritually. By my early teens, the very things that had felt so good about Unitarian Universalism were beginning to be unsatisfying to me. Frankly, I sometimes craved easy answers rather than always more questions. I also began to recognize that I was missing what I would now call a sense of reverence and longing for a sense of ritual, although I don't think I would have had that language to put around it in my childhood. Unitarian Universalism, of course, has never been an exclusively humanist faith, but that location and time is one in which humanism was very, very strong in our faith, and a particular flavor of humanism that was very, very secular leaning. My childhood church was full of people who I loved dearly, but who had thrown out anything that felt religious from their backgrounds because of the wounds that they had experienced in the faiths that they grew up in. In my own church, therefore, I experienced encouragement to intellectual growth and to understanding the wisdom that was to be found in many world religions, but with little or no emphasis on Christianity, because that was the primary source of many of those wounds. I did experience reverence and ritual when my religious education class used the neighboring faiths curriculum, and we visited several Protestant congregations and a synagogue. I also found a sense of awe in the natural world that I had frankly never felt in church, any church. I especially felt that in the majesty of mountains and the immensity of oceans, both of which made me feel simultaneously very, very small and part of something very powerful.
And as a teen, I moved into the public school system to go to high school. I made friends who were not Catholic. I discovered things that were meaningful for me and helped me deepen my own sense of self and understanding. And those things were music and nature and literature and my friendships that I created. But I never did find that at church. And I watched my Lutheran friends who I would go to summer Lutheran Bible camp with. And I would watch them as they lost themselves in these ecstatic worship experiences. And I envied them the depth of faith that they had, the sense of belonging, and the unhesitating commitment to truth and tradition. There was that in my faith too, but for some reason, for me, it did not call to me. So by my late teens, the question became, where can I find what I need to inspire me? And how do I get to that place?
As it turned out, it was my father's military career that gave me the chance to explore other faiths in a deeper way. We moved away from Omaha after my 8th grade year, and for the rest of my childhood, we lived far from any Unitarian Universalist church. Seeking reverence and ritual and belonging, I went to church with both Lutheran and Catholic friends. I even attended the entire second year of Lutheran confirmation class with a friend, where I quickly found out that asking questions wasn't as welcome there as it had been in the Unitarian Universalist church of my childhood. And I quickly discovered that although a part of me still did long for easy answers, those teenage years have enough challenges, I just wanted easy answers. But a faith with a creed that I could not fully believe in was a worse fit for me than a faith that made me do the work of finding my own truth. Ultimately, I always considered myself a Unitarian Universalist with or without a congregation to belong to.
And I was always a Catholic because for generations, the Hellmans and the Fows had always been Catholic, and that's what you were. There were no other options. And so that meant that I had to figure out how to find meaning within Catholicism, because to me, there was no choice of leaving that faith. And so I chose a Catholic college. I went to St. Ben's up by St. Cloud, run by the nuns who were lovely, but they were still Catholic nuns. And I tried to study my way into a deeper spirituality. I studied theology and psychology, and I tried to intellectualize my way into something that made me feel. And it, of course, didn't work, because that's not how that works. And so after getting very frustrated, I finally figured out that I could study other religions. They did offer classes on other religions there. And so I started expanding my experience of religion, of theology. I started expanding the things that I read, the sources of what I read. And I was fortunate enough to be able to travel during college and study abroad and do some traveling. And so I was meeting people and seeing places with very different worldviews than anything that I had experienced growing up. One of the people who began mentoring and companioning me was a professor at St. Ben's who was a very active and faithful Jewish woman who lived here in St. Louis Park and would drive up there to teach a class every once in a while. And we became good friends. She was a good mentor to me. And I remember my senior year of college, after I'd come back from studying abroad and traveling abroad and reading some things that my parents probably would have never wanted me to read. And I was taking a walk with her one day, and I turned to her and I said, I don't think I believe in Jesus anymore. Is that okay? And she looked at me and she said, Shay, I'm Jewish. I don't care if you believe in Jesus. So, it was probably, she was the best person for me to say that out loud to for the first time ever.
Travel and reading also led me into deeper spirituality as a young adult. In my late teens, my family was living overseas, and I unexpectedly experienced the presence of the holy, a word I had probably never used before, in European cathedrals, in Egyptian temples, in Turkish mosques, and in ancient stone and wooden circles in Great Britain. I also found a connection to the feminine divine through fantasy novels in which women priestesses served a goddess. When I moved back to Nebraska to finish college, I made increasingly frequent visits back to that childhood church in Omaha. I found that the culture there had shifted. It was still heavily humanist leaning, but a generational change in the leadership of the congregation had led to an increasing interest in spirituality and ritual. I felt much more at home there, and I soon joined, my first time as an official member of a congregation.
Are you getting whiplash from the back and forth? All right. After college, after saying out loud for the first time that I had acknowledged that I had left Catholicism behind and Christianity, I needed to get away from Minnesota and North Dakota and try something new. I needed to find myself. And so I joined a volunteer program, kind of like AmeriCorps, and they sent me out to Washington State, out to Tacoma, where I worked in a homeless shelter for 2.5 years. And while working there, I discovered all sorts of things, but most importantly to my spiritual journey, I discovered the feminine divine. I discovered that the holy could look like me, and that there were different ways of understanding and imagining what the sacred and the divine in the world looked like. I was mentored by really strong, independent women who I would put in that seeker or searcher category, who identified with different religions but explored everything. And I found exactly what I had been looking for, but it wasn't structured. I had just I was putting together things I gathered from all over the place, and things that I learned from whoever happened to be present in my life at that time. So there were times during my early 20s where my spirit and my search were strong and confident, and I was certain of who I was and what I believed. And then there were times where all of that got lost among the minutiae of everyday life and busyness and stress. And as I moved through my young adulthood, I found myself on this very windy path that kept taking me all over the place, near and far, to what I thought I needed and what I thought I wanted and what I had never imagined I needed. And at one point on that path, when I was 30 and I came out as gay, I was back living in North Dakota because my dad was sick. And I Googled, where is it safe to be gay in North Dakota in 2004. And the only answer I got from Google was, there's a tiny Unitarian Universalist fellowship in Bismarck. You can go there. And so I did. And I showed up one Sunday morning to this teeny tiny little church, if you've ever been there. Teeny tiny little place. Maybe there were like 12 people there. They didn't have a minister at that time. And I showed up, and they welcomed me in because, I was 29, and I was like 30 years younger than anyone in the place. And they welcomed me in, and for a couple months, that was my safe haven as I began to explore a new place and my new way of being in the world. Also, over the years, I've struggled with anxiety and depression, which I know a lot of people do. And through that struggle, I've discovered meditation and some of the Eastern wisdom traditions that have helped me manage my mental health. And after 20 years of searching and seeking and winding along and discovering all kinds of things and losing touch with other things, I was living in Northern California and I was looking for a job, and I answered a Craigslist ad to be the admin of a little tiny church. And I showed up for the interview and I saw the sign out front said the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Humboldt County, Northern California. And I said, oh, I remember UUs from back in the day when I was coming out. And I got the job and I started working with them, and I had finally found my people.
In my mid-20s, nudges towards ministry began to happen, although it's much, much easier for me to see them in hindsight. I kind of held them at a distance and tried to ignore them for most of my 20s and part of my 30s. The first thing I remember happening is that my mother said that she thought my best friend would make a good UU minister. My instant reaction was a jealous, hey, what about me? Followed immediately by denial. What made me think that? I don't want that. I don't want to be a minister. Several years later, when that congregation in Omaha was without a minister and members were taking turns leading worship, I very reluctantly gave my first sermon. I had told them I hated public speaking and couldn't I just edit the newsletter or something. But what happened is that I got into the pulpit for the first time and I discovered that preaching is absolutely nothing like the public speaking that I had hated so much. And so finally, at age 30, I went to my first General Assembly with my mother. We are a multi-generational UU family. And there I heard an unmistakable call to ministry. Even then, I postponed it. I was finally living my dream of being a professional writer, and I didn't want to give that up to become a minister. In my 30s, I developed a further connection to the feminine divine at a UU church, which I had previously only known through books. And the awareness of it within myself arose when I attended my first winter solstice singing ritual in Spokane, Washington. And then I joined the women's choir there that performed that ritual every winter solstice. It became what I think of as the cornerstone of my personal spiritual year. Eventually, I did realize that I didn't have to choose between writing and ministry, between getting a Master of Fine Arts degree in creative writing or a Master of Divinity. I only had to choose which one to do first. I chose the MFA, and 4 years after finishing that, I began seminary.
And we can bet she's not done yet. So as Diana and I were putting together this sermon, I always tell my story of coming to ministry as when I got that job at the Humboldt Fellowship, I had found my place, and that's when I started feeling a call to ministry, and they really encouraged me. But actually, it started back when I worked at the homeless shelter, and I was serving people there and chaplaining them, really, without the correct training to do it, which is never a good thing. But that was where I really began to feel this call to a sort of ministry. The very idea of that word back then would have terrified me. I mean, it terrified me at the age of 40 when I did go to seminary. But during my 20s and 30s, I was still kind of figuring myself out, and I was moving around and trying different kinds of jobs and different relationships, and thought I had found my purpose many times. But I think one of the challenges that I kept running into was that I had no grounding. There was no structure because I hadn't found a faith that would hold me as I moved through my life through challenges and triumphs. and all of that. And it wasn't until I finally got to that UU church in my late 30s and finally began rebuilding a groundwork for both my sense of self and for some truths in which I could rest and come back to, that my call to ministry really made itself known. And it came with a bang. Within a year, I was researching and calling seminaries and getting ready to start that journey.
As an English major in college, I had always wished that I could fit a class called The Bible as Literature into my schedule, because I was aware of that as a gaping hole in my cultural literacy as a result of growing up in the particular place and time in Unitarian Universalism that I did, where we did not focus on Christianity. At the same time, when I dreamed of becoming a minister, I always imagined attending one of the 2 Unitarian Universalist seminaries. However, after reconnecting with my first childhood minister and having several more what I call nudges from the universe, sometimes they're more like 2x4s than nudges, but after that, I chose to go to the same seminary that minister had gone to, a progressive Methodist seminary with a religiously diverse student body, including a small cohort of about a dozen Unitarian Universalists. Choosing that seminary gave me opportunities to address the gaps in my own religious education, especially around scripture and around Christian church history, and also to equip myself for interfaith partnership that was based in mutual knowledge and respect.
I chose to go to a UU seminary because I knew very little about Unitarian Universalism. I was brand new to the faith, really. So I went to Starr King in Berkeley, which is one of our 2 UU seminaries. And at Starr King, I was part of the Graduate Theological Union, which is this consortium of, 12 to 15 different seminaries of all different kinds of faiths. And that meant that I could take classes at any of them. And so I intentionally, in seminary, not only focused on learning as much as I could about Unitarian Universalism, but also took classes at the Catholic seminaries, because I wanted to reintegrate some of that Christianity, some of that tradition back into my own belief system. I wanted to rediscover some of the beauty within the tradition that I had grown up with. And later in my formation process, I did a year of chaplaincy training working at Ebenezer down in Burnsville, where I was a chaplain to mostly Lutheran elders, and had to really learn again how to integrate the Christianity of my childhood into my ministry, because that's what they needed and wanted. And so I ended up using all of those experiences to heal a lot of the wounds and the hurt that had accumulated during all the years of Catholicism, where that faith that I had grown up in told me that I was less because I was a woman, or that I was sinful because I was a lesbian. All those years of experiences also helped me separate the religion from the church, and to remember the essence of Jesus' message without having it all tangled up in millennia of patriarchy and empire and capitalism.
I too carried some negative messages from my childhood church as much as I loved it. Not about my value as a woman, especially since the 2 ministers who served my childhood church while I was there were both women. In fact, I used to joke that I thought all UU ministers were women, and here there are 3 of us in the room now. So I did not grow up thinking of myself as less than because of my gender. The harmful and hurtful messages that I absorbed from my childhood was that Unitarian Universalists are exclusively rational people, and that in turn means that there is no place for spirituality or for mysticism, no room for mystery in our faith. Even after I understood that not all Unitarian Universalists are humanists, let alone that particular kind of humanist, I still thought that I had to choose between being humanist and being spiritual. I rejected the label humanist for myself for many years, despite there being parts of it that appealed to me, because I associated it with, quite frankly, the disdain that I had witnessed some humanists expressing for people like me. people who had mystical experiences, people who love ritual, people whose faith is found not only in our heads, but also in our hearts and our spirits. And then during my ministerial internship, I read a book by William Murray called Reason and Reverence. And I was finally able, through that book, to claim the term humanist and claim that side of our faith as my own. I realized reading that book that, as its title suggests, I didn't have to choose between reason, being a rational person, which had attracted me and my family to Unitarian Universalism all those years ago. I didn't have to choose between that and the spirituality that I had missed in those early years and worked so hard to find. I realized that our faith is large enough to hold both.
So these very different paths have led us to remarkably similar places. I mean, we're both standing here in front of you. Serving as UU ministers, we both were serving small congregations in New England, and now we're here both in support positions in larger UU churches. And I want to give you a quote from author Paulo Coelho. He says, "It's one thing to feel that you are on the right path, but it's another to think that yours is the only path." As Diana said at the beginning of this story, each of us, each of you, came here following a path that was uniquely yours alone. And every single one of our paths and your paths are valid. Maybe you recognize some of your story in mine or Diana's. Maybe none of it seems familiar and you have a completely different story. Whatever your path was and is, it brought you here to this place, and it is part of the beauty that you bring to the richness of the diversity of this community. You may have heard some things that surprise you about me or Diana. You've now learned a lot about both of us. We definitely learned new things about each other as we were working on this sermon. And we hope that what you take away from your time with us today is that none of us can fully assume we know or understand the journey of any other person. We don't know the fullness of what brought each one of us here to this place. And sometimes we can forget that and we can make assumptions. We can forget that it's actually the diversity of our journeys that makes us strong and that deepens our community. I'm going to ask you to remember just a few things as you move forward today. Remember that not everybody comes to Unitarian Universalism from somewhere else. There are people who grew up in this faith, and they've had their journeys just as anyone else had. Remember that those people have questions and doubts. They had obstacles and struggles just like everyone else, and they can have wounds as much as anyone else. Each of us has had to and continues to learn things about ourselves and make choices about our lives. I'm going to ask you to remember that not all of us were raised with religion. There were people who weren't raised in the Lutheran Church, not very many around here. The Lutheran Church or the Catholic Church or the Methodist Church. There were and are people among us who aren't wounded by some past religious experience. They're just here because they want to be here. They found this place through some grace and divine movement of the universe, and here they are. They don't have past wounds to heal. There are simply people who are UUs because that's what feels right to them. But mostly I want us to remember that the rich theological diversity of which we are so proud and by which we are so blessed includes Christians, includes people who have been raised as UUs, and includes people who have never had religion before and have found us. All of us and all of our journeys combined make us who we are today.
So how do we stop making assumptions about each other about our fellow congregants and our journeys here? How do we begin to understand and value each person's personal search for truth and meaning? I think the answer is in applying much of what Chad said to us a few weeks ago when he was talking about interactions with people of other faiths, taking that wisdom and applying it within our own community. It means taking a risk, having the courage to tell our stories, and having the presence to listen to the stories of others. I wonder if you know what the person sitting next to you, if you're in the room, or in the box next to you, if you're on Zoom, believes, what the core of their belief is. Do you know if they're a theist or a humanist or something else? Do you know if they identify more with Unitarian or Universalist theology, or both? What or who along their path influenced their beliefs? We don't always talk about these things with each other. And then there are questions for you personally. What from your past might you reclaim or reframe or rediscover in the safety of this beloved community? What might you need to let go of in order to move forward in your own individual spiritual journey and the shared journey of this community? Spiritual growth only happens when we show up authentically, take risks, encourage and listen to each other's stories, and ground ourselves in our shared principles while celebrating the wild and wonderful variety of theologies that exist among us. May it be so. Amen, and blessed be.